Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Hemlata Nagarajan from the English and Foreign Languages University, Hyderabad. Today I am going to deal with the module Introduction to Phonetics and Phonology, which is part of the paper Introduction to Linguistics. First of all, we will deal with the difference between phonetics and phonology. Then move on to discuss the speech mechanisms involved in the description of sounds, consonants as well as vowels. Then we will study the history of phonology, classical phonology or phonemics as it is called, which dealt with the identification of a phoneme versus an allophone. Then move on to generative phonology and the basic ideas of generative phonology. This is just an introductory lecture on phonetics and phonology. First of all, what do we mean by phonetics and phonology? You know that languages are made up of different parts. When we speak of a language has a sound system. It is made up of words, it is made up of sentences, etc. So, the area of linguistics that deals with speech sounds is phonetics and phonology. I am sure you would want to know the difference between the two, phonetics and phonology. For instance, you know that the human vocal apparatus can produce a number of speech sounds. When we feel sad, for instance, we say, that is, we sympathize with someone. This particular sound may not be part of your language inventory. For instance, you may not have a word which has this sound in it. But there are languages of the world which have this as part of their language inventory. Phonetics deals with the production of speech sounds by humans, often without prior knowledge of the language being spoken. In phonetics, we deal with the articulation of sounds, and the branch of phonetics that deals with this is articulatory phonetics. When we produce a word or when you produce a sound, it passes through a medium, and this medium is acoustic phonetics. So, acoustic phonetics deals with the medium through which the sound waves pass. And finally, we have perception of sounds, which is auditory phonetics. So, the three main branches of phonetics are articulatory phonetics, acoustic phonetics, and auditory phonetics. Now, let's move on to phonology. Phonology deals with the patterns of sounds. For instance, there are a number of speech sounds that the human vocal apparatus can produce, as I mentioned earlier. Not all these sounds are part of a particular language. So, each language selects a certain combination or a certain set of sounds from all the sounds available as part of its inventory. Phonology looks at this aspect. Phonology looks at the patterns of sounds that you find in languages of the world, the different patterns of sounds which you find in different positions in words. To give you an example, just listen to the sound L when I say leave and listen to the sound L when I say pull. Do you perceive a difference? The L in leaf is produced in the front part, whereas the L in pull is in the back part of the mouth. So the L in leaf is known as a clear L, whereas the one in pull is called the dark L. Phonology is interested in such aspects of speech sounds. The question you may ask is, why study phonology? We study phonology to understand 1. How sounds are produced, 2. To understand how these sounds pattern in a language or how they are organized in a particular language. And finally, once we understand what the sounds of a language are, it tells us why speakers have a difficulty in learning or acquiring a second language. To give you an example again, many Telugu speakers have a problem in pronouncing zoo. They would say Jew, or a word like bus becomes bussu. Why is it so? It's because Telugu language does not have the sound z, and it does not allow certain consonants at the end of words. Therefore, they add a vowel to a word like bus and make it basu. Same is the case with a word like school, which may be pronounced as is school by many speakers of Hindi or any other North Indian language. So each language has its own inventory of sounds, and therefore when you try to acquire another language which does not have this, it becomes difficult to learn the language. Take a look at this diagram. This diagram shows us the different cavities and organs that are involved in the production of speech sounds and how these sounds are produced. There are a series of organs and cavities that form a passage from the lungs to the mouth or the nose. This entire cavity is known as the vocal tract. The air, you know that we either breathe in or breathe out. The sounds that are produced when we breathe in air are known as ingressive sounds, and the speech sounds that are produced when we exhale air are known as egressive sounds. Most speech sounds of the languages of the world are produced with an egressive air mechanism. The air that comes from the lungs can be modified in different regions of the vocal tract in different ways. And this gives rise to various sounds that we can produce. Now, what are the main organs or cavities involved in speech production? First of all, let us start with the lungs. The lungs function as a motor that sets the airstream in motion, which sets the passage of air in motion. Now the air from the lungs passes through the larynx. The larynx is the passage situated between the trachea and the pharynx or the Adam's apple. The function of the larynx is very important in speech because it has a valve that can interfere the passage of the air stream. The epiglottis, which is an elastic piece of cartilage, has no function in speech but acts as a valve. So it can interfere in the airstream, in the passage of the airstream. Now let us move on to what are known as the resonators. The airstream from the larynx is subject to further modifications depending on the shape of the cavities or the resonators. The three main resonators are the pharynx, the nose, and the mouth. The pharynx is the rigid structure at the top of the larynx. It extends from the top of the trachea and the esophagus to the rear part of the soft palate. So the passage of air can be affected in three ways. One, the soft palate may be lowered, in which case the air can be slightly lowered so that the air can escape either through the nose or the mouth. If the soft palate is completely lowered, then the oral passage is closed and the air escapes through the nasal cavity. And when the soft palate is held in the raised position, the air escapes solely through the mouth. Now we move on to the articulators. So initially you have the lungs which produce the air when we breathe out. Then we have the resonators, and now we have the articulators. You have two kinds of articulators. The active articulator, which moves, and the passive articulator, which is fixed and which does not move. There are four main articulators: the palate, the mouth, the tongue, and the lips. Now, what is the palate? The palate is the concave structure separating the mouth from the nasal cavity. It is a passive organ and it is made up of different parts: the alveolar ridge, the hard palate, and the soft palate or the velum. Next, you have the mouth. You can change or modify the shape of the mouth in different ways to produce different kinds of speech sounds. Then you have the tongue. The tongue is an active articulator because the tongue can move backwards and forwards. The tongue can be used to touch the alveolar ridge or the hard palate or the soft palate or the velum. So the different parts of the tongue are the tip, blade, and front of the tongue. The tip and front of the tongue are together known as the crown of the tongue. Finally, we have the teeth, that is the upper and lower teeth, which can also interfere and stop the airflow coming from the lungs. And the lips, which can also adopt different shapes and therefore interfere in the passing of air from the lungs. You will get to know more of this when you study the unit on phonetics. Usually in phonetics, for every sound, we have a three-term label that is given. One, we say whether the vocal cords vibrate or not. If a sound is produced with the vibration of the vocal cords, it is known as a voiced sound. If a sound is produced without the vibration of a vocal cord, it's a voiceless sound. Compare, for instance, the production of the sound, which is voiceless, with b, 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 which is voiced. Next, place of articulation. This tells us as to which part of the mouth or nasal cavity is involved in the articulation of a sound, which is the active and which is the passive articulator. Finally, manner of articulation, which deals with whether there is complete closure, partial closure, or no closure of the air passage. Now take a look at the next slide, which is called the International Phonetic Alphabet. The International Phonetic Alphabet, as the name suggests, gives us the phonetic symbols that can be used to describe the speech sounds produced in languages of the world. The column on top refers to the places of articulation. Bilabial refers to the lips, labiodental, lip and teeth, dental, teeth, alveolar, alveolar ridge, postalveolar, behind the alveolar, retroflex, the curling of the tongue behind the alveolar ridge, palatal, when it touches the palate, then velar, the velum, uvular, pharyngeal, and finally glottal. The ones to the left refer to the manner of articulation. Plosives are sounds that are produced with complete closure of the air passage, and there is explosion or plosion when they are produced with a sudden release of air. Nasals are produced with the air passage moving from the nasal cavity. Trills are produced with the active articulator hitting the passive articulator several times. Tap or flap just once. Fricatives are produced with friction. So when the passive and the active articulator come close together and there is narrowing of the passage so that there is friction in the production of those sounds. Approximants are sounds produced where the active and passive articulator do not come close together. There isn't a narrow passage, so air flows freely between these two articulators. This is the diagram that is used to describe vowels of any language. The main factors here are whether it is front part of the tongue or the back part of the tongue that is involved, whether the sounds are produced in the close, half open or open position, or whether there is any lip rounding involved in the production of the vowels. Now, what were the discovery procedures used in classical phonemics to identify a phoneme? There were 4 principles involved in the identification of phonemes of a language. The 4 principles were the principle of complementary distribution, the principle of phonetic similarity, the principle of semantic contrast, and the principle of pattern congruity. Here is a diagram that I have given you in your e-text which describes how we can identify if a sound or 2 sounds are 2 different phonemes or allophones of the same phoneme. If the 2 sounds are in complementary distribution, if the answer to the question, are they in complementary distribution, if the answer is yes, then you ask the next question if there is any phonetic similarity. For instance, take the 2 sounds per, the unaspirated per and the aspirated per in English. Aspirated per occurs at the beginning of stretched syllables and the unaspirated per occurs elsewhere. So they are in complementary distribution. Where one occurs, the other one does not occur. Is there phonetic similarity? Yes. Both of them are bilabial, voiceless, plosive sounds. So they are allophones of the same phoneme. Now compare these 2 sounds with the sound h and ng in English. H occurs at the beginning of a word and ing occurs at the end of a word. So they are in complementary distribution. But is there phonetic similarity? No. H is a voiceless glottal fricative and ng is a voiced velar nasal. Therefore, they are different phonemes. Now, if 2 sounds are in parallel distribution, that means they occur in the same environment, like take per and b in English. You can have 2 words, pat and bat. The question you ask is, substituting one sound with another sound, does it give you a semantic contrast or a change of meaning? The answer is yes. Therefore, per and b are 2 different phonemes. If they do not, then they are allophones. Now we move on to generative phonology. Generative phonology believes that there were drawbacks in the earlier system in the identification of phonemes because there you looked only at surface contrasts. In generative phonology, the main idea was to look at features that make up a phoneme. It is not an accident of a language that in English you have only voiceless plosives aspirated per ter. It's the same set of sounds that occur after the sound s in English and before another consonant when you have a 3 consonant cluster at the beginning of a word as in strip, spray, etc. So distinctive features help us to characterize all natural segment classes. So the question that we ask is, what is common to per, ter and k? So it helps us to talk about rules that apply to these class of sounds. It helps us to describe all segmental contrasts in the world's languages, and these are definable in phonetic terms, which is known as the naturalness condition. distinctive features gives you a list of the major features that we use to describe sounds of the languages of the world. You have major class features, laryngeal features, manner features, place features, and tongue body features. You will get to know more about this in the unit on phonology, or generative phonology. Apart from introducing the notion of distinctive features, generative phonology also believed that there should be a distinction made between two types of phonetic information, idiosyncratic and systematic. This leads us to the notion of underlying and surface representation. So, if you take a word like taxi, it is idiosyncratic that in English a word like taxi refers to a four-wheeler vehicle that takes people from one place to another. It is also an accident that there is another word called cab which also has the same meaning. However, when you look at the word cab, the feature that the k is aspirated and the vowel is lengthened because of the voice sound at the end is a systematic regularity of the language. So there is a difference between idiosyncratic and systematic information, which is captured by positing two levels of representation, the underlying representation and the surface representation. So the idiosyncratic information is given in the underlying representation. Then you apply rules to the underlying representation to derive the surface representation. So in generative phonology, you have rules, and these rules are ordered in a particular fashion to give you what is known as the surface representation. In recent approaches to phonology, you have constraints rather than rule ordering. This is known as optimality theory. You have a section or module on optimality theory in the unit on Introduction to Phonology. To sum up, this module dealt with the difference between phonetics and phonology. It dealt with the speech mechanisms involved in the production of different sounds which are used in languages of the world. It dealt with classical phonemics and the discovery procedures that were proposited to identify a phoneme of a language, the four principles involved. And finally, we dealt with generative phonology and the main ideas that were posited in generative phonology. You have references at the end of the module with the web sources which you can refer to. You also have exercises at the end of the module which you could take a look at and try to solve. Thank you.